Greetings, scholars. My name is Dr. Corinne Warner. I am an associate professor in the School of Social Work, and I am also the Master of Social Work Program Director. I'm going to be talking today about the importance of research in non-STEM disciplines, which for me is social work, because that is my background, both in professional practice and in research. I joined the faculty at Clark Atlanta University in 2013. Prior to that, I was a practicing social worker. What that means is I had my license. I was a licensed Master of Social Work. I also continue to maintain my license even now. But before moving into academia, I worked in child protection, foster care, schools, and I also worked for several years at a domestic violence agency. And I did a lot of therapy, both with individuals and groups. And I also did some community prevention work. My experiences in practice very much inform the research that I have done and continue to do. It helps me come up with ideas, it helps me to understand the problems that I'm looking at, and it also helps me to understand what I need to do or what kind of questions I need to come up with so that I can create research that is going to be useful to people who are still working in the field of family violence. I want to give you a better idea of how I got to where I am so that perhaps you can think about how your interests can develop into something that is exciting and interesting to you. So my journey into social work really began back when I was in undergrad. My major was American Studies and a focus in political science, which is not too far of a leap into social work, but I didn't even know that that was a profession at the time. I ended up doing an internship with a foster care team, which sort of started me on that path as I started to realize that it was important to me to do something with my career that was useful to other people, where I felt like I was doing something good. After I graduated, I worked in child protection for about a year. I was actually living in another country, and I learned a great deal, got some world experience, some career, professional experience, and that was a really fantastic opportunity. And because of that, it really solidified for me that social work was the career path that I was looking for, and it also helped me to realize that if I was going to advance in that career, I had to get my master's degree. So I came back to the States and I went to Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and got my Master of Social Work degree. That was a clinical degree, so it trained me to be a clinician, and I focused on children and families. So I think that's always where my interests really were. And throughout that time, I was working in schools. I started getting experience in domestic violence, working at an agency, and then that continued after I finished my master's and began working on a Ph.D. And it was during that time when I was working on my Ph.D. that I started doing research in that area. So I still had one foot in the practice world where I was doing therapy and community work, and then I had one foot in the academic world where I was conducting research on all different types of projects. And I will be telling you more in a little bit about some of the projects that I worked on, and I started to see how connected the research that I was doing was with the practice world, and how important it is to make sure that what you're doing in research has utility in the practice world. I have been very fortunate over the years to get experience in a lot of different areas of research, a lot of different styles of research, qualitative, quantitative, different types of methods and statistical analysis. And what's nice about that is that in social work, there are so many different things that you can potentially look at, and having all of those different tools allows me to adapt and be able to come up with research questions and research designs that can answer all different types of questions that might come up. So my particular area of expertise would be survey research. I did my dissertation on dating violence, and specifically I was looking at the relationship between sense of entitlement and dating violence perpetration. So I was looking at, does sense of entitlement increase the likelihood of somebody using abusive behaviors towards a partner, and looked more specifically at different subtypes of abuse and where there were stronger connections or no connections at all. That is kind of different from this other study that I was a part of, which was looking at professional efficacy of social work students. So part of what I do is I am training future social workers as a professor in social work, and I find it very useful from time to time to actually look at students as a potential research area to see, are the things that we are teaching them actually getting through to them, and are they prepared when they go out into the professional world to deal with different populations or different issues that they might come up with. So both of these studies involved survey research, but came about it, from very different angles. My dissertation study was an online anonymous survey, and it kind of needed to be done that way because of the types of questions that I was asking. There's some somewhat sensitive questions. I wanted it to be anonymous so that people could really feel like they could be honest about the types of behaviors that they were using. And that was done, like I said, it was online, so it was emailed to a large group of people. So we're able to capture large amounts of data at once. That particular study, I think, had almost 900 respondents. The professional efficacy study was done with social work students. In order to increase our response rates and get more people to participate in the study, we actually went out into classrooms with paper and pencil surveys to try and get them to participate. So a different style of survey research, but still survey research nonetheless. And that was helpful as well because, for something like that, we were trying to get a broader understanding of what was happening among a group of people. Social work can really run the gamut of different styles of research, and psychology often is more associated with lab style research. Social work doesn't often get into that, but sometimes it can. We can get back to that. But I have also been a part of randomized control studies in social work. So several years ago, I was part of a research group that was tasked with evaluating an economic empowerment curriculum. So there was someone who had created an economic empowerment curriculum. It was designed specifically for survivors of domestic violence. So people who are often trying to get back on their feet, might have experienced financial abuse. And they had created this and they wanted to see, does it work and how does it work? What sort of benefits are there to the people who complete this curriculum? And we were able to work with a number of different agencies, domestic violence agencies from across the United States. And within those agencies, we had separate groups, and some were randomly assigned to groups where they did whatever the normal, typical interventions were for that particular agency. So a lot of them already had some type of group going on there, but it wasn't necessarily a economic empowerment curriculum group. And then, of course, the rest of the people in the study were randomly assigned to the economic empowerment groups. And then we were able to make comparisons across time as to whether this particular curriculum had benefits in certain domains. And it was also a longitudinal study, so I believe we tracked people for about 18 months after, and we were able to see whether those effects also lasted beyond just the immediate impact of being in the group. And that was an interesting study as well because, like I said, we had 3 different regions that were represented in the country. We had multiple agencies, and it was a fairly large-scale effort to try and coordinate across all of these different states, different agencies, different people. And we had a whole research team that worked on that for quite some time to make that study happen. Something that gets talked about in social work and some other related disciplines is community-based participatory research. And this is an approach that really comes from the idea that if you're doing research in or on a community, that you are often the outsider, and that there's a certain amount of arrogance or hubris that comes with the idea that you can come in and somehow understand that community. And so community-based participatory research comes to the research with the idea that you have to engage with the community in order to do effective research. And that means asking them questions throughout the process, getting their feedback, having people be a part of the design process, and really looking at including the community in the research that you're doing. So you're coming in as an expert in terms of methods and existing research, that sort of thing, but the community is the expert on themselves, and they help inform what you do. I have been involved in a number of projects that took this approach. One project that I worked on, we did interviews and focus groups with women who were either divorced or separated, and they were trying to get back into the workforce. And of course, there was a large overlap with domestic violence. As a part of that process, we talked a lot with the agencies that were providing these services. They helped provide us with questions that they wanted answers. You know, what were they looking to get from this research? They helped us design questions. And then they were also an integral part in recruiting people to participate in the interviews and the focus groups. And there was a lot of discussion throughout that entire process to ensure that this research was actually going to produce something that was useful to the people who were providing services, and then ultimately be useful to the women who were using the services. I also was part of another project where we were looking at Latina women who either utilized or did not utilize domestic violence services. This was an agency that was a domestic violence agency that was set in a community where there was a large Latina population. However, they were finding that the women that were using their services, by and large, were not Latina women. So, you know, just doing some simple calculations, you can look at this and go, there should be Latina women who are experiencing domestic violence, but they're not using our services. So where are they going? Why are they going there? Why are they not seeking services? That sort of thing. So that agency asked us to help them look into this and figure out sort of what is going on and what could be done differently, or where they might be missing this population with their efforts. And as a part of that, I was not part of that community. My research team was not part of that community. We initially did not have Latina women on our research team. And so for that, we had to engage with both the domestic violence agency to find out more about their culture, their community, what was going on within their agency, but then also talk with other people in the community and find what we would call key stakeholders who could help us first design the study, ask questions, figure out how we could approach this. And then we also, again, needed their help with how do we find these women? Because again, we're talking about this sort of missing group. We're looking, really what we wanted to do was talk with women who had not used services and find out why they were not accessing these services that were available to them. And to do that, we had to find people in the community who had those connections, who could help us find women that we could interview. They also, in different cases, we had people who were conducting the interviews for us. And again, all of this is because, as kind of outsiders that were coming from a university setting, we couldn't just walk up to people and start asking them questions. That's not going to work. You have to engage the community in order to be able to access the people that you're looking for. And the more vulnerable the population is that you're trying to access, the more likely it is that you're going to need people in that community who are going to help you gain access to that group. I was also part of another study, a program evaluation, and this one was really fascinating to me. There was, this was sort of related to what I was talking about before with the interviewing women. There was a program that was specifically designed to help Latina women. There were two different agencies in this community. One that provided domestic violence services, who were not getting a lot of Latina women using their services. And then there was another agency that provided more social service type help. So things like heating assistance, rent assistance, food stamps, more along those kinds of types of assistance. And a large portion of their clientele were Latina families, Latina women. These two agencies knew that they were missing each other, that somewhere there was an overlap between the services that they provided and the people that needed their services. And so part of what they did was they actually created a separate program that these two separate agencies came together, created a position where this individual who was bilingual, bicultural, part of the community, worked across both agencies. So they spent half the week at the domestic violence agency, half of the week at the social service agency. And very quickly after starting the program, they, whatever their goal was for the year in terms of people utilizing the services, they reached that within the first couple of months. So it was wildly successful. And they kind of went, well, we need to figure out exactly why. What did we do here? And it was fascinating to me because this sort of collaboration between agencies is somewhat unusual. And so what we did was we came in to look at the program itself and at the agencies to look at what did they do? What is it about these agencies that made this happen? And we ended up doing interviews with people from both agencies, kind of from the top down, and we very specifically recruited people from the executive directors, so the people at the very top of the agencies, all the way down to the most frontline workers, staff, and tried to get a really wide swath of people to understand what was it that helped make this program so successful. And so I've kind of gotten to some of the points of why it was so successful. It really was that these two different agencies both saw a need. They saw that there was overlap. So having that ability, that insight to see that is really important. Then they had the buy-in from people at all different levels at both of these agencies. They understood the needs of their communities. They also were respectful of the other agencies' expertise. And it was a really beautiful program that they were able to create to fill this gap of services, and that they were, instead of competing for resources, which a lot of community agencies are doing, they saw that they could come together and create something that was really focused on the needs of their community. And so that was really interesting. from a program evaluation to see why something was so successful. And it's a completely different approach too, because you have to come into this with, where do you start? How do you design a study like that? And there are theories that help drive all of that. You have to look at the literature, you have to look at existing theories on management and agency structure and community resources to design something that will then give you a framework for how to go in and evaluate it and look at why is this program successful. The idea being that because it is successful, you can then go on to hopefully make recommendations for other people to try and replicate it in their communities. Currently, I am working on a research project that is funded by the National Institute for Justice. We have funding to look at campus climate and sexual assault at HBCUs. Campus climate, if you're not familiar with that term, is looking at the atmosphere or the culture of an institution and looking at how that impacts people's understanding of sexual assault, whether they're willing to report it, where they go for resources, whether they feel supported or protected, that sort of thing. This is a collaborative project. I am working with a whole team of people. I'm also working with some people from Rutgers. I have maintained contact with a lot of my mentors there. Sometimes I consult with them on methodological issues, statistical issues, various projects, funding, all different kinds of things. And one of my mentors very graciously agreed to work with me on this project. So we are working together across our institutions for this project. And we are also working with liaisons from some other sites, other HBCUs, because even though the project originates from Clark Atlanta, which is an HBCU, we can't really assume that those of us at Clark Atlanta know what the culture or the climate is like at another HBCU. So we enlisted people from the community at these other institutions, both liaisons that are kind of our primary points of contact, and also advisory boards at each of the institutions. And they help us with things like reviewing the survey to make sure that it's relevant to their campus, making sure that we have resources at each community, making sure that the language and the way that we market and recruit students to participate in this, make sure that it's all relevant for each of the communities that we are trying to research. This is survey research that I talked about a little bit earlier. We're using confidential surveys, confidential online surveys. Participants get a $30 gift card. And of course, for this project, this is quite large because it involves 4 institutions. In terms of institutional review boards, budgets, team members, we have to coordinate this across a lot of different institutions. And then of course there's a lot of reporting that goes on because we are using federal dollars, so we have to make reports to NIJ regularly. And so it's probably the largest project that I have ever been involved in. I also want to tell you a little bit more about some of my students that I have worked with over the years and their research in social work so that you can get kind of a broader view of the types of research that can be done. Eddie Valentine was a doctoral student I worked with several years ago. His interests were around veteran mental health, veteran suicidality, and he had a strong background in neuroscience. And this is where I started to make my own shift into learning about neuroscience and the brain and, neurobiology. His dissertation looked at veteran suicidality. We also, the two of us, worked on a slightly separate project where we collaborated with Emory and their neuroscience lab to look at oxytocin and vasopressin, which are neurochemicals that are in theory related to suicidality, mental health, that sort of thing. And I say somewhat related because some of the results that we got were not as strong as we were anticipating, and we then had to kind of adjust and think about like, okay, well, why did we find that? What are we missing? Or did we perhaps use a methodology that didn't really capture it in the way that it needed to be captured in order to find something that was measurable? Natasha Williams graduated a couple of years ago. She did her dissertation research very closely related to my current project, the campus climate and sexual assault, and more specifically, she was looking at things like students' knowledge of Title IX policies to get a sense of whether that impacted whether or not people would actually seek help or report if they were a victim of sexual assault. I am currently working with Janicia Mickens, who's a Ph.D. candidate, so she is working on her dissertation at the moment. She is still developing some of her research questions, but sort of broadly speaking, it's looking at ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And, you know, a little background about ACEs, that is this idea that it's really about the cumulative effects of different traumatic experiences in childhood that can impact people later on in life. So she's looking at the cumulative effect of ACEs and looking at mental health, risky behaviors, and suicidality. I also have worked with quite a few students over the years on master's theses. We don't require this anymore, so we have a lot fewer students who pursue a master's thesis when they're getting their master in social work. But some of my previous students have looked at things like mental health service utilization by African American women. And I had another student who looked at the impact of culture and minority status on the experience of domestic violence among African American women. I also had other students who pursued projects where you know, they used all different types of methods and statistical analyses. So Dr. Valentine, his dissertation used existing data. We use some existing data on veterans because it actually can be really difficult to get veterans to participate in research. So for his dissertation anyway, he used data that was already out there and that he was able to access. And then the project that we did with Emory, we recruited, and I got to see firsthand just how difficult it can be to recruit veterans. Natasha did her own data collection. Janicia is using a secondary data set that's actually a public data set that anyone can look. It's from the CDC. And then my master's students have done all different types, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about different types of research in just a second. In social work, there are so many different types of research and methods that can be used. And that helps us, I think, to adapt to the really wide variety of topics that we're looking at and social problems that we're trying to research. I had been a part of some more lab-based studies. So the research project at Emory, that was a study where we were looking at oxytocin and vasopressin. So that included both an interview that was conducted by clinicians, myself included, but there was also, we would take them to give blood and sputum samples in order to measure the neurochemicals that we were interested in. So there's all different, collaborations that can happen across disciplines and also different styles, whereas you don't necessarily as commonly see laboratory research in social work, it certainly does exist. Like I mentioned before several times, survey research is really where I do a lot of my work. There's kind of this misconception, though, I think that you can put together a survey and send it out and that's fine. As someone who's very much immersed in the world of survey research, I can tell you there are entire textbooks written on how to do survey research effectively. And I have seen, even in the 10, 15 years that I've been doing survey research, that a lot of those recommendations have changed. Interestingly, there are also people who do research on survey research. So the best practices and recommendations that come out on survey research are actually coming from a different style of research where people do different experiments to see what works. Does an incentive work? And if so, how much of an incentive, what types of incentives actually work? How do you get people to respond? What sort of response rates can you expect? There's a whole world of research on research methods, which I also find fascinating and incredibly useful. I don't necessarily do that kind of research, but I love that I have access to other people's knowledge so that I can do better research myself. I mentioned earlier there's all different types of qualitative research that can be done, interviews, observational research. There's also some lesser known, or sometimes people don't recognize it as research, but there are things like literature reviews or systematic reviews that are also really helpful. And that can be things like looking at everything that's been published in a certain time period on a particular topic so that you can synthesize what's out there and, provide that to someone else to really get a sense of the bigger picture of what is happening. There's even something else that sort of crosses the line here between qualitative and quantitative, where people do meta-analyses and they look at, they have to look at the literature and all the things that have been published on a particular topic, and then they take the data, the reported data, and then analyze that to see if the trends hold up, because you can sometimes find that one study might have some really interesting finding, but the weight of that one study, when you start to look at it in the broader context of everything else that's been published, perhaps it changes the perspective or the implications from that one study. I also had a colleague several years ago who looked at websites on a particular topic and analyzed the content of those websites. And again, that is a type of qualitative research and very useful and interesting, very informative for people who are trying to look at how to present content, what is useful, and maybe where some of the gaps are in that particular topic about what people can access in that area. This picture that you see is my former doctoral student, Dr. Natasha Davis-Williams. That was when she was defending her dissertation. So she's extra happy there because she was officially Dr. Williams there. I include this picture because presenting your work is so important. I hope that as you've listened to this, that you're getting ideas about the types of work that you can do. I also hope that you're looking at how sometimes even the work that you're doing before you get to the results is also important. And I say that because we have this wonderful research symposium that Clark Atlanta puts on every year. And it's a great place to showcase your work, even if that work is not completed yet, because sometimes there are lessons to be learned in the efforts that go into this. I can tell you from the project that I'm working on right now with Campus Climate, I have learned so much, and I have been talking with our research team. We are far from done with that project, but we have all talked about regularly about how much we are learning and how there are a lot of lessons in what we're doing that we would like to pass on to other people so that when they go to do this type of research, they will not be starting from scratch like we are with some things, and they'll have kind of an idea of some of the pitfalls that they can avoid, and also learn from some of the things that worked really well for us. I included a quote on here from Gloria Steinem that says, "Knowledge that is not accessible is not helpful." I actually have that quote up in my office as well, because I think that when you learn something, the whole point is to tell someone else. If keeping it to yourself isn't helping anyone, and so you need to present it in a way that is useful, helpful, and that makes it to the people who need to know that information. So long story short, you should present your research. The Research Symposium at Clark Atlanta is really a very supportive environment. It looks great on your CV, which it looks great for also if you're thinking about applying to grad school. It's good experience to learn how to talk to other people and explain your research. But above all, you should be proud of the work that you're doing and understand that it's important to get that information, that knowledge out into the world. And you never know what you're going to learn in doing that, because you might meet other people along the way with similar interests, or people who might want to collaborate or might have other opportunities for you. So I think that the Research Symposium is a great way to get started with that, and then hopefully that is a jumping off point for whatever you want to do next with your research. I hope that you have found this presentation useful or interesting. If you ever want to get in touch with me and talk more about my research or your research or other ideas, whatever it might be, please don't hesitate to reach out. I've got my office number on there. I'm in Thayer Hall, room 232. And then my email is on there. That is the best way to get in touch with me. I'm always on email, and you're welcome to reach out anytime. I love talking about research, and I love hearing about what other people are doing. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything you want to talk about. Thank you so much for listening.